I'm Lachlan Whitaker, Alaskan wildlife officer who survived 90 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted, temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit within days. I now lead 17 strangers in a school gymnasium fortress. Our food is dwindling. The cold never stops. Strange wolf packs circle our shelter. Death is a daily threat. This is how we survived when civilization froze. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Lachlan Whitaker. Most people call me Locke. Until 3 months ago, I was a wildlife conservation officer in Alaska. Search and rescue specialist. Tracker. 15 years in one of the harshest environments on the planet. Now I'm recording this on a barely functioning camera we found in what used to be Lincoln Elementary School in Bozeman, Montana. This is day 90 of what we're calling the long freeze. I never thought the skills that kept me alive in Alaska would become the only thing keeping 17 strangers alive in Montana. But here we are. I'm making this recording because someone should document how quickly everything changed. How quickly we adapted. How quickly we learned what matters. I was visiting my brother when it happened. Just a normal Tuesday morning. We were having breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. Normal things from a world that doesn't exist anymore. The coffee cups rattled first, then the windows. My brother thought it was a truck passing by. We had no idea it was the beginning of the end. The tremors kept coming, stronger each time. We turned on the news and saw the first reports. Yellowstone, the caldera. The thing geologists had warned about for decades, but nobody really believed would happen in our lifetimes. The supervolcano had erupted. The initial blast wasn't even the real threat. It was what came after. The meteorologists said we might see temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees. By nightfall, it had already dropped 30. By the next morning, pipes were freezing across town. The ash cloud was blocking the sun. Global dimming, they called it before the broadcasts stopped. Less sunlight meant rapid cooling. Volcanic winter. The start of an ice age. I've been having dreams about endless snowfields for months before it happened. In my last patrol in Alaska, I noticed the caribou were migrating too early. Birds were flying in strange patterns. Nature always sends warnings if you know how to listen. I should have recognized the signs. Maybe part of me did. It's why I immediately told my brother to start gathering supplies. He thought I was overreacting. Most people did. But I've seen how quickly the wilderness can kill the unprepared. Cities aren't any different when the lights go out and the cold moves in. We filled his truck with everything we could find. Canned food, propane, blankets, medical supplies, ammunition. The grocery stores were already packed by that afternoon. People fighting over the last loaves of bread like it was the end of the world. Turns out it was. I convinced my brother's neighbors to join us. Safety in numbers. We pooled resources, made plans. Most people were still waiting for FEMA or the National Guard. I knew better. In true disasters, you're on your own. By day 7, Bozeman didn't look like American anymore. It looked like the Alaskan backcountry in deep winter, except with buildings poking through the snow. The power grid failed on day 4. Cell towers lasted another 2 days. Internet went next. Radio signals became distorted. The cold was changing everything faster than anyone predicted. The others started looking to me for guidance. I didn't want the responsibility. I'm not a people person. Never have been. That's why I chose Alaska. But I knew how to keep people alive in extreme cold. That knowledge suddenly became the most valuable currency in our new world. I told them right away. Democracy ends when survival begins. In the wild, you follow the person who knows the terrain or you die. Nobody argued after the first night hit negative 30 degrees. Our first major decision came when individual homes became impossible to heat effectively. The power had been out for days. People were burning furniture, books, clothing, anything for heat. It wasn't sustainable. We needed a central location with better insulation and defensible positions. I scouted several possibilities before settling on Lincoln Elementary School. The school had everything we needed: large space, minimal windows, cafeteria supplies, and brick construction that would hold heat better than anything else in the neighborhood. The gymnasium could house everyone. The kitchen still had non-perishable food. The maintenance closets had tools. Most importantly, it had a diesel generator for emergencies and several hundred gallons in an underground tank. Moving 17 people through snow-choked streets was the first real test of our group. Temperature that morning was negative 25. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. We formed a convoy. 4 vehicles. carefully packed with our remaining supplies. I took point. My brother brought up the rear. We had to move in daylight, exposed. I spotted them watching us from the bank building. 3 men tracking our supplies like wolves. I made sure they saw my rifle. There's a certain body language that communicates intent across any distance. They kept their distance, but I knew we'd see others like them again. My first task at the school was securing the perimeter. Broken windows needed covering. Doors required reinforcement. I built survival shelters all over Alaska, but never for 17 people with no end date in sight. We established zones within the school, sleeping quarters in the gymnasium, communal areas in the cafeteria, medical station in the nurse's office, and storage in the library. On day 10, we discovered the Ransoms hadn't joined us. Elderly couple from the end of my brother's street. I took 2 men and went to check on them. Their home had become their tomb. The windows were frosted on the inside. That's when the reality hit everyone. This wasn't a temporary emergency. The bodies were frozen solid. We couldn't even move them. Had to leave them there. First casualties of many. I established routines immediately. In Alaska, I learned that routine keeps you sane in isolation. Wake up, check supplies, maintain shelter, find food, secure perimeter. Repeat until the world makes sense again. I assigned tasks based on skills and physical capability. Everyone contributed. Everyone had purpose. It was the only way to keep despair at bay. The cold became a living thing, an entity searching for any weakness in our defenses. It found them in the gymnasium windows first. Despite our plastic sheeting and tape, frost formed on the inside of the covering. We sacrificed classroom doors to create wooden shutters, tore apart desks to reinforce weak points, used school library books to insulate walls. Food became our next critical concern. We had supplies from our homes and what remained in the school cafeteria. I created a tiered rationing system based on physical exertion and body mass. Nobody liked it, but hunger makes people practical very quickly. I assigned scouting parties to search abandoned buildings in a methodical grid pattern. My brother Thomas led the first successful scavenging mission. They'd found an untouched convenience store 3 blocks away. The security gate had frozen shut, preserving everything inside: canned goods, energy bars, bottled water. Cigarettes became valuable trade items even among our small group. Strange how those old habits persist. It was during one of these supply runs that we discovered something unexpected. Jason, a former IT specialist from my brother's neighborhood, had been tinkering with an old hand radio we found in the teacher's lounge. He picked up a transmission on an emergency frequency. Fragmented, distorted, but clearly human and clearly organized. The transmission mentioned secure facilities in Arizona and New Mexico, places where the government had prepared for continuity operations. It sounded too perfect, too convenient. I was immediately suspicious, but others saw it as salvation. The message repeated for 2 days, then disappeared completely. The revelation split our group. 8 wanted to attempt the journey south. I tried explaining the realities of winter travel in these conditions. Tried describing how vehicles fail, how fuel freezes, how quickly frostbite sets in. How the highways would be impassable death traps, filled with abandoned vehicles and desperate survivors. They didn't want wilderness wisdom, they wanted hope. Something to move toward instead of just surviving in place. I couldn't blame them. Maria, a nurse who had proven invaluable for her medical knowledge, became their leader. She had family in New Mexico. The possibility they might be in one of these government facilities was too tempting. I gave them as many supplies as we could spare, showed them the safest routes on our maps, warned them about the signs of hypothermia and frostbite. They left on day 28. The temperature was negative 35 degrees with clear skies, as good conditions as they could hope for. We never heard from them again. With our numbers reduced to 9, we reorganized our operations. The school felt emptier, quieter. The silence of the world outside seemed to seep through the walls. No birds, no distant traffic, no planes overhead. Just the constant moaning of the wind and the occasional cracking of trees as they froze from the inside out. New health issues emerged as the weeks passed. Respiratory problems from the constantly recycled air. Cold injuries despite our precautions. Vitamin deficiencies from the limited diet. My medical knowledge was basic wilderness first aid, but I'd seen enough emergency situations to recognize trouble. Sandra, a retired hospital administrator, became our medical officer. She organized what supplies we had and implemented preventative measures, regular physical activity, rotating vitamin supplements, breathing exercises, mental health checks. It wasn't sophisticated, but it kept us functioning. My prosthetic foot became a particular challenge. Most people don't notice it when I'm walking normally. 15 years ago, a climbing accident in Denali. The metal in my prosthesis became a conductor for the cold, freezing the tissue of my stump. Each morning, I'd have to warm it by the fire before I could even stand. I kept this private as much as possible. Leaders can't show weakness. By day 35, the temperature outside had stabilized at around -40 degrees, a new normal. We adapted our scouting patterns, limiting exposure to 15 minutes maximum. That's when I noticed something disturbing during a perimeter check. I found wolf tracks circling our perimeter, but they weren't normal patterns. They were methodical, almost strategic. In 15 years, tracking Alaskan predators, I'd never seen anything like it. The tracks appeared overnight, made a perfect circle around our building, then disappeared into the tree line behind the playground. The wolves never showed themselves, but their presence changed something. We were being watched, evaluated. It reminded me that nature adapts faster than we do. The normal rules were changing. Evolution accelerating under extreme pressure. What would emerge from this frozen world would be different from what came before. We crossed the 40-day mark with cautious optimism. Our systems were working. The generator was providing limited power for heat and cooking. Our food stores, while not abundant, were stable. We had established a snow-melting system for water. The school had become a functioning outpost in a dead world. That's when the true test began. The main heating system, which we'd been carefully nursing along with the generator's limited fuel, failed catastrophically. A frozen pipe burst, flooding the mechanical room before freezing solid. We had 40 minutes before the core temperature of the building would drop below freezing. After that, we'd be burning furniture just to stay alive through the night. We had 40 minutes before the core temperature of the building would drop below freezing. After that, we'd be burning furniture just to stay alive through the night. I gathered everyone in the gymnasium to explain the situation. Panic is contagious in survival situations, so is calm. I kept my voice steady as I laid out our options. The science teacher in our group, Dr. Peterson, suggested we could create a temporary heat exchanger using materials from the chemistry lab. It was theoretical, but possible. We divided into teams. Some gathered all available combustible materials. Others helped Peterson with his improvised system. My brother and I tackled the frozen mechanical room. The ice had transformed the room into a cave of blue-white crystals. Beautiful in its way, deadly in its implications. We used propane torches from the maintenance closet to carefully thaw critical components. Time was working against us. The temperature in the gymnasium had already dropped 10 degrees. Peterson's contraption worked just enough to prevent catastrophe. A combination of alcohol burners, copper tubing, and aluminum sheeting created a rudimentary heat transfer system. Combined with our emergency fireplaces constructed from metal trash cans, we stabilized the temperature at just above freezing in our sleeping area. That night changed everything. We realized how precarious our situation truly was. One mechanical failure away from freezing to death. The older members of our group suffered the most. Mr. Gunderson, a 72-year-old retired postal worker, and his wife Emma developed hypothermia despite our best efforts. Sandra worked through the night, warming blankets, heated water bottles, body heat from volunteers. It wasn't enough. We lost Emma just before dawn. Her husband followed 3 hours later. We couldn't bury them. The ground was like iron. We couldn't keep them inside. In the end, nature provided the only solution available: preservation in the ice. We created a small enclosure on the north side of the building, sheltered from the wind but still exposed to the cold. A resting place. Maybe someday, when the world thawed, someone could give them proper burial. Or maybe the ice would keep them forever. Silent sentinels of our struggle. The deaths hit everyone hard. Depression settled over the group like another layer of frost. People spoke less, ate less. Some struggled to get up in the morning. What were we fighting for if this was all that remained? Just delaying the inevitable. I recognized the signs from long winters in isolated outposts. The psychological effects of extreme conditions can kill as surely as the cold. I implemented protocols I'd learned from Arctic survival training, mandatory daily group meetings, scheduled activities requiring focus and cooperation, regular rotation of duties to prevent monotony, light exposure therapy using our limited generator time to power UV lamps salvaged from the science classroom. Most importantly, I encouraged the sharing of stories, personal histories, skills, knowledge, anything to remind us of our humanity and the world that existed before. James, a construction worker, taught basic carpentry. My brother shared his knowledge of local history. Sandra organized a course on first aid. We became teachers and students in our frozen academy. That night, after we lost the Gundersons, I walked outside into the storm. For a moment, just one moment, I understood the appeal of simply walking into the white. The cold promises peace if you just stop fighting. The northern lights were dancing above the clouds, green and purple waves in a sea of stars. The beauty and indifference of nature. I stood there until I couldn't feel my face. What brought me back was responsibility. These people depended on me, not because I was special, but because I had knowledge they needed. In the wilderness, purpose is the only reliable anchor. I returned to the gymnasium and added more wood to our fires. The following week brought new challenges. The infection in my leg had been worsening for days. The constant cold and moisture had irritated the connection point of my prosthetic. I hid the fever for 3 days. In the wild, weakness invites challenge. In survival situations, the appearance of control matters almost as much as actual control. Sandra discovered my condition during a routine medical check. The infection was serious. Without antibiotics, sepsis was a real possibility. We had already used most of our medical supplies treating cold-related injuries. Sandra suggested we needed to search the local medical clinic. I knew I couldn't lead the expedition in my condition. My brother Thomas stepped up. He'd been watching me closely, learning the survival techniques I'd implemented. He organized a small team, himself, James the construction worker, and Lisa, a former pharmacy technician. They took our most reliable vehicle, a modified SUV with chains on all 4 tires. The 12 hours they were gone were the longest of my life. The storm intensified. Visibility dropped to near zero. The temperature plummeted further. Sandra treated my infection with what we had: hot compresses, alcohol cleansing, and our last course of broad-spectrum antibiotics. The fever made me drift in and out of consciousness. When I heard the rumble of the SUV's engine returning, the relief was overwhelming. They had found the clinic partially intact. Most prescription medications were gone, but the veterinary supplies in the back storage room had been overlooked. Animal antibiotics are often identical to human ones, just differently dosed. Lisa's pharmacy knowledge proved invaluable. The medication worked quickly. Within 2 days, the fever broke. The infection began to recede. During my recovery, something unexpected happened. The group continued functioning smoothly without my constant direction. Thomas had stepped naturally into a leadership role. Others had taken on additional responsibilities. They had adapted. It taught me an important lesson about survival. True resilience isn't about one person's knowledge or skills. It's about creating systems that can function even when key components fail. No one is indispensable in a properly organized crew. This realization allowed me to make a decision I'd been avoiding. About 5 miles from the school stood a small research facility. I'd noticed it on maps of the area but hadn't prioritized investigating it given our immediate needs and limited resources. It was operated by a university consortium studying climate patterns in the northern Rockies. With my strength returning, I decided to make the journey alone. The others protested. It was too dangerous for a solo expedition. The wolves had been spotted again. The temperature was dropping further as we entered the 2nd month of continuous winter. But I needed to go, partly to prove to myself that I was still capable, partly because something about the facility nagged at me. Climate research might hold answers we desperately needed. I prepared carefully. Multiple layers of clothing, emergency supplies, signal flares, the most detailed map we had. I left at first light, when the temperature was marginally higher and visibility was best. The landscape had transformed into something alien. Familiar landmarks buried under 20 feet of snow. Buildings warped by the expanding ice. Cars transformed into indistinct lumps beneath white shrouds. The journey took longer than expected. My leg still wasn't at full strength. The snow had drifted in some areas to the height of telephone poles. I had to navigate carefully, testing each step for hidden crevices or weakened structures beneath the surface. The sun never truly rose, just created a slightly brighter glow behind the perpetual cloud cover. I spotted the research station by the array of weather instruments, still protruding from the snow. The building was partially buried, but the reinforced construction had held. The entrance was blocked by ice. I used my ice axe to chip away at the frozen door, careful not to damage the frame. It took nearly an hour of exhausting work before I could force it open. The interior was dark and preserved like a tomb. No signs of violence or panic. Just an orderly evacuation. Papers still on desks. coffee cups still in sinks. The researchers had simply left, probably in the first days after the eruption, before they understood what was coming. I found the generator room and managed to activate the emergency power. The lights flickered on, revealing a facility frozen in time. The computers were dead, but physical records remained. Binders of data, charts, printouts, and most valuable of all, a comprehensive climate research library with historical records of previous volcanic winters. I spent hours reviewing their materials. The data they had gathered told a story. This had happened before. Not in human memory, but in Earth's. Their models showed even catastrophic volcanic winters follow predictable patterns. The darkness wouldn't last forever. The sun would return. Maybe not next month or next year, but it would return. More importantly, I found detailed topographical maps showing underground thermal features. Natural hot springs, geothermal vents, places where the Earth's heat came close to the surface. Potential resources for long-term survival. One such feature was marked less than 2 miles from our school shelter. I gathered everything useful I could carry. Emergency rations stored in the facility. Scientific equipment. Medical supplies from their first aid stations. The maps and climate data. The sun was setting as I prepared to leave. The darkness in this new world came swiftly and completely. That's when I heard it. A howl unlike anything I'd encountered in Alaska. Deeper. Resonant. Answered by others in a complex pattern. The wolves have found me. I caught glimpses of movement through the facility windows. Larger than normal wolves. Moving with uncanny coordination, I was trapped. I prepared for a siege. Barricaded the doors. Took inventory of potential weapons. Planned escape routes. This wasn't my first predator encounter, but something felt different. These weren't normal wolves behaving normally. They were hunting with strategy. For hours, they tested the perimeter, probing for weaknesses, taking turns applying pressure to different entry points. I stayed vigilant, moving from window to window. Around midnight, they suddenly withdrew. The silence was more unnerving than their howls had been. I waited tense, unsure what this meant. The reason became clear with the first tremors. Another seismic event, smaller than the eruption, but significant enough to shake snow from the roof. The wolves had sensed it coming. Their retreat was not surrender but survival instinct. The tremors increased in intensity. I needed to leave immediately before structural damage trapped me inside. I used the distraction to make my escape. The wolves were nowhere to be seen. The quake had opened new fissures in the snow, creating a treacherous landscape I needed to cross in near total darkness. My headlamp provided the only illumination as I navigated back toward the school. The return journey was a nightmare of physical endurance. The new snow formations required constant vigilance. My injured leg throbbed with each step. The cold had intensified following the seismic activity. But the information I carried provided something we'd been missing. Something perhaps more valuable than any physical supply. Hope based on evidence. I arrived at the school shortly before dawn. Thomas had organized a search party that was preparing to leave as I approached. The relief on their faces quickly turned to excitement as I shared what I discovered. We spread the maps and data across tables in the cafeteria. For the first time, we weren't just reacting to our circumstances. We were understanding them. We stopped thinking about surviving until rescue and started thinking about building something that could last. The difference was immediate. People stood straighter, worked harder. The climate data suggested this volcanic winter might last anywhere from 2 to 5 years, depending on multiple factors. Not forever. Not the end of humanity. Just a brutal phase we needed to endure. The topographical maps revealed the geothermal feature near our location. An underground hot spring that came within 50 feet of the surface, less than 2 miles from our position. If we could access it, we'd have a sustainable heat source independent of our dwindling fuel supplies. It would require excavation in frozen ground, but it was possible. With this new information and renewed sense of purpose, we reorganized our priorities. Long-term planning replaced day-to-day survival. We established a sustainable water collection system using the school's gutters and a filtration system built from sand, charcoal, and gravel layers. We created a more efficient waste management process using composting techniques I'd learned from agricultural stations in Alaska. Most importantly, we began preparing for a major expedition to secure additional supplies. The climate data had revealed a pattern to the storms. Brief windows of relative calm between major systems. If we timed it correctly, we could reach the sporting goods warehouse on the edge of town during one such window. The location would have critical supplies for long-term survival, cold weather gear, hunting equipment, water purification, preserved food. Planning this expedition became our focus as we entered the third month of the long freeze. We were no longer just survivors. We were becoming pioneers of a new way of living in this frozen world. The question wasn't if we would survive anymore. It was what we would build in the process. Planning the expedition to the sporting goods warehouse required meticulous attention to detail. We couldn't afford mistakes. I created teams based on our strongest skill sets. Thomas would lead the main acquisition group with James and Dr. Peterson. Sandra needed to remain at our base to maintain medical support. I would guide a smaller second team to scout the route a day ahead of the main group. The storm patterns from the research facility data proved accurate. We identified a 48-hour window of relative calm approaching in 3 days. The temperature would still be dangerous, hovering around -30, but visibility would improve and the wind would temporarily decrease. These conditions would be as good as we could hope for. I selected Lisa to accompany me on the scouting mission. Her pharmacy background had given her an eye for detail, and she'd proven herself adaptable in crisis situations. We would move light and fast, marking the safest route and identifying potential hazards before the main team followed with our transport. The morning of the scouting mission arrived with an unsettling stillness. The constant background howl of wind had diminished to a whisper. The sky remained dark gray, but distinct cloud formations were visible for the first time in weeks. I could see my breath crystallizing in the air as we prepared our equipment. Lisa and I dressed in our most effective cold weather gear, layers of synthetic fabrics, wool, and the limited technical outerwear we'd scavenged. I showed her how to wrap her face properly, leaving only a narrow slit for the eyes. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes at these temperatures. We each carried emergency packs with signal flares, first aid supplies, high-calorie food bars, and insulated water containers kept close to our bodies to prevent freezing. We left at first light, such as it was in this perpetual twilight world. The town had transformed into a monochromatic landscape of white and gray. Buildings stood like icebergs rising from a frozen sea. Some structures had collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. Others were reinforced by the very thing that threatened them. Encased in crystalline shells, we moved carefully along the route I'd mapped, checking for structural hazards or signs of other survivors. The sporting goods warehouse was 4 miles from our shelter. Under normal conditions, a simple journey. Now it required expedition-level planning. We marked the route with bright orange surveyor's tape at regular intervals, visible guides for the main team to follow. 2 miles in, we encountered our first major obstacle. The bridge over Surdo Creek had partially collapsed. Ice had formed in impossible architectures around the broken concrete. Beautiful and deadly. We spent an hour finding and securing an alternate crossing point upstream, where the creek had frozen solid enough to support our weight. The silence was the most unnerving aspect of our journey. No birds, no distant traffic, no human sounds whatsoever. Just the crunch of our boots on snow and the labor of our breathing. I kept scanning our surroundings, alert for movement. The wolves had been absent from our school perimeter for days. I didn't believe they had gone far. We reached the commercial district by midday. The warehouse stood on the outskirts, a large rectangular building with minimal windows and loading bay doors. From our observation point 100 yards away, it appeared structurally intact. No obvious signs of forced entry. This was promising. As we approached closer, I noticed something that made me pause. A single set of tracks leading to a side entrance. Recent. Within the last 24 hours, someone else had discovered our objective. I signaled Lisa to remain still while I observed the building for signs of occupation. 10 minutes passed without movement. We needed to determine if the warehouse was already claimed by another group. A confrontation in these conditions could be deadly for all involved. Resources created conflict in survival situations. I had seen it before in remote locations when unexpected encounters occurred. The human threat could be more dangerous than any environmental challenge. I made the decision to approach alone. Lisa would maintain our observation position with our emergency signal flare ready. 1 long blast if I needed immediate assistance. 2 short blasts if she spotted danger I couldn't see. We synchronized our watches and I moved forward, staying low and using snowdrifts as cover. The side door showed signs of forced entry. The lock had been broken cleanly with a pry bar or a similar tool. Professional work, not desperate smashing. I drew my hunting knife, the only weapon we had brought, and entered carefully. The interior was dark but warmer than outside. Not heated, but sheltered from the wind. My eyes adjusted gradually to the dimness. The warehouse was largely untouched. Tall shelving units loaded with inventory, camping equipment, fishing gear, winter clothing, hunting supplies, a survivalist's treasure trove, but something felt wrong. The tracks led directly to the hunting section and stopped. Whoever had entered knew exactly what they wanted. A sound from the back office caught my attention. Subtle movement, someone trying to be quiet. I positioned myself with a clear path to the exit and called out. Sometimes direct confrontation is safer than prolonged tension. A voice responded, male, young, frightened. He asked if I was military or government. I explained I was neither, just a survivor like him. He emerged slowly from the office. Teenager, maybe 17. Thin, but not starved. Well equipped with quality cold weather gear. He introduced himself as Eli, said he was alone. His family had been traveling to a female outpost, rumored to be operating in Idaho, when their vehicle broke down. He'd been separated during a blizzard, been on his own for 2 weeks. I didn't believe him. The body language was wrong. The story too convenient. I asked about the tracks. Only one set leading in. He claimed he'd circled the building several times looking for the best entry point. Possible, but unlikely in these temperatures. No one wastes energy or exposure time in this cold. I kept him talking while maintaining my position between him and the exit. Asked about where he'd been sheltering, what his plans were, if he'd encountered others. His answers were vague, but not obviously fabricated. Then he made a mistake. He mentioned hearing about our school shelter. Said another survivor had told him about it. We had been extremely careful about security. No one who wasn't part of our group knew our location. I asked who told him. He realized his error and his demeanor changed instantly. Called out to someone named Marcus. 3 more figures emerged from different hiding positions among the warehouse shelving. Adults, armed with hunting rifles. Well organized. They had set up an ambush. Their leader, Marcus, was a former military type. The professional calm that comes from experience with violence. He'd explained their situation without emotion. 15 survivors in a warehouse complex 3 miles west. Organized, armed, running low on food. They'd have been tracking our movements for weeks. Knew about our school shelter. We're considering taking it by force before discovering we found the sporting goods warehouse. I kept my expression neutral as I processed this information. They had us outnumbered and outgunned. But they hadn't moved against us yet, which meant they were open to alternatives. Marcus suggested a deal. They would allow us to take what we came for today. In exchange, we would agree to combine our groups at the school location. Pooled resources, shared knowledge. His security expertise with our survival systems. The offer seemed reasonable on the surface. Strength in numbers. Complementary skills. But I had survived in hostile environments long enough to recognize a predatory approach. They would integrate, learn our systems, and then take control. The school was more defensible than their current location. Our water and heat solutions more sustainable. I needed to buy time without provoking conflict. I explained that I wasn't authorized to make such decisions for our group. Said I was just scouting ahead for a larger team. Suggested a formal meeting between leadership to discuss terms. Marcus wasn't pleased but accepted the logic. We agreed to meet the following day at a neutral location halfway between our territories. They'd allowed me to leave with that understanding. I rejoined Lisa, and we retreated quickly along our marked path. I waited until we were safely out of earshot before explaining the situation. We needed to warn the others and prepare defensive measures immediately. We returned to the school by mid-afternoon. I called an emergency meeting and explained the encounter. 15 armed survivors with military leadership now knew our location, our routines, and our resources. They had proposed merging our groups, but their true intentions were clear to anyone who understood survival dynamics. The debate was brief but intense. Some argued for immediate relocation, others for accepting the merger under careful conditions. A few suggested we should strike first before they had the chance to organize against us. I listened to all positions before offering my assessment. Relocating meant abandoning the sustainable systems we'd established. The geothermal feature we'd identified was our best long-term prospect. Accepting their merger would place us under constant threat from within our own shelter. Striking first violated the ethical principles that separated us from mere survivors and made us a community. I proposed a fourth option, negotiation from a position of strength. We would fortify our location, establish clear defensive protocols, and meet with their representatives as agreed. But we would dictate terms that protected our community's integrity. We wouldn't fight unless forced, but we would be prepared if it came to that. The next 24 hours transformed our school shelter. We barricaded all ground floor windows, established defensive positions covering each potential entry point, created secure fallback areas within the building, relocated our critical supplies to protected central locations, inventoried anything that could serve as a weapon. Thomas and James constructed simple but effective alarm systems around the perimeter. Tripwires connected to noisemakers fashioned from school band instruments. Sandra prepared additional medical supplies for potential injuries. Dr. Peterson identified chemical compounds from the science lab that could be used for defensive purposes if necessary. I selected Thomas and Lissa to accompany me to the meeting. We armed ourselves with the few weapons we had: my hunting knife, a fire axe, and makeshift spears crafted from mop handles with sharpened metal attachments. Not impressive, but better than nothing. We departed at the arranged time, leaving the others on high alert. The meeting location was an abandoned gas station halfway between our territories. We arrived early and secured advantageous positions. Marcus arrived with 2 others, all carrying rifles, but maintaining a non-threatening posture. The negotiation began cordially enough. He repeated his merger proposal, emphasizing the mutual benefits. I countered with our position. We were open to alliance but not integration, trade but not unification, coordination but not subordination. Each group would maintain its independence and territory. We could establish regular communication and resource-sharing protocols, help each other with specific needs or threats, but separate leadership and separate shelters. Marcus argued against the inefficiency of this arrangement. I acknowledged his point but remained firm. Trust needed to be earned over time, not branded on first meeting. He asked what would happen if they simply took what they needed. I explained calmly that we were prepared for that possibility, that violence would damage both groups beyond any short-term gain. The tension was palpable, but rationality prevailed. Marcus was a survivor first, a fighter second. He recognized the practical wisdom in avoiding unnecessary conflict. We reached a tentative agreement. Our groups would remain separate but allied. We would trade resources on a scheduled basis, share information about threats or opportunities, assist each other in emergencies. We returned to the school cautiously optimistic, but realistic about the fragility of our arrangement. The immediate crisis had been averted, but a new dynamic had entered our survival equation. We now had neighbors with unknown long-term intentions. The encounter changed our strategic planning significantly. The major supply expedition to the sporting goods warehouse was postponed. Instead, we focused on securing our position and advancing our sustainable systems. The geothermal project became our highest priority. A reliable heat source independent of fuel would be our greatest advantage. Dr. Peterson and James led the effort, combining scientific knowledge with practical construction experience. Using the maps from the research facility, they identified the optimal drilling location in the school's rear courtyard. We constructed a simple derrick using materials from the maintenance department and shop classrooms. The drilling process was labor-intensive in the frozen ground, but the potential reward justified the effort. After 5 days of continuous work in rotating shifts, we hit our target. A gush of steam signaled success. The underground hot spring was exactly where the geological survey had indicated. The water wasn't boiling but warm enough to create a significant temperature differential we could harness. Peterson designed a heat exchange system using copper piping salvaged from throughout the building. Within 2 weeks, we had constructed a functional geothermal heating system. It wasn't powerful enough to heat the entire school, but it maintained a critical core area at a sustainable temperature without consuming our limited fuel resources. This breakthrough changed everything. We now had indefinite heating capability, the single most important factor for long-term survival in our frozen world. Our next focus was food production. The research facility data suggested this winter could last years. No existing food stores would sustain us that long. We needed to grow our own food without sunlight or normal growing seasons. The solution came from an unexpected source. The elementary school science curriculum included hydroponic growing kits for classroom experiments. We expanded this concept using materials throughout the building. Converted classrooms became growing chambers. We utilized the limited electricity from our generator to power UV growing lights for a few hours daily. Planted fast-growing, nutrient-dense crops from seeds found in the science classroom and a teacher's desk. Spinach, radishes, beans, small-scale production, but a start towards sustainability. The day we harvested our first hydroponic crop was a turning point. Fresh vegetables after months of canned and preserved food. A tangible success that boosted morale more than any words could. We celebrated with a communal meal, carefully portioning the precious fresh greens to ensure everyone shared in the achievement. As we approached day 90 of the long freeze, I took inventory of our situation. 9 survivors working as a functional community. Sustainable heat through geothermal tapping. Beginning food production through hydroponics. Clean water system. Secure shelter. Tentative alliance with a neighboring group. We had transformed from desperate survivors into something resembling a society. This wasn't the end of our challenges. The world remained frozen and hostile. Resources would always be limited. Trust with our neighbors remained fragile. But for the first time since the eruption, I allowed myself to think beyond immediate survival. To contemplate what kind of community we might build in this altered world. What knowledge and values we should preserve for whatever came after. The true measure of humanity isn't how we function in abundance, but how we adapt to scarcity. Whether we maintain our compassion and cooperation when tested by extreme circumstances. Our small group had faced that test and thus far maintained our essential humanity. That, perhaps more than any physical resource, was worth preserving. As day 90 approached, we had established a functional community within our school fortress. Our geothermal heating system maintained a livable temperature in our core areas. The hydroponic gardens were producing their first harvests. Our water collection and filtration systems operated efficiently. We had created something sustainable in a world that had become fundamentally hostile to human life. But sustainability wasn't enough. We needed to expand our resources, particularly food and medical supplies. The postponed expedition to the sporting goods warehouse remained a priority, though complicated by our new relationship with Marcus's group. According to our agreement, that territory was now under their control. We would need to trade for access. I sent Thomas to arrange a meeting. He returned with mixed news. Marcus was willing to trade access to the warehouse in exchange for knowledge, specifically our geothermal heating technology. It was a steep price. The heat system was our greatest achievement and security. Sharing it would eliminate our primary advantage if relations deteriorated. We debated the proposal extensively. Dr. Peterson argued that scientific knowledge should be freely shared for humanity's benefit, especially in our desperate circumstances. Sander countered that our survival might depend on maintaining certain advantages. I understood both perspectives but considered the practical reality. The sporting goods warehouse contained items we couldn't produce ourselves: fishing gear, ammunition, cold weather equipment, preserved foods. We decided to share a modified version of our heating system design. Enough for them to implement something functional, but without the refinements we developed through trial and error. A compromise that maintained some advantage while establishing good faith. I personally delivered the technical documents and basic instruction to their compound. Their setup was impressive in its way. The warehouse complex they'd secured had been converted into a defensible position with clear military influence, organized watches, strategic fortifications, efficient use of limited resources. Marcus gave me a brief tour, clearly demonstrating their strength while evaluating our technological offering. The most unsettling aspect was their arsenal. Military-grade weapons positioned throughout the compound. Far more firepower than necessary for defense against the elements or desperate scavengers. They were prepared for war in a world where large-scale conflict seemed improbable, given the basic struggle for survival. It reinforced my caution about their long-term intentions. Our technology exchange was completed with formal courtesy. They granted us supervised access to the sporting goods warehouse the following day. We would be allowed to select a reasonable quantity of supplies under their observation. Not ideal, but acceptable under the circumstances. I selected James, Lisa, and Sandra for the acquisition team. Their combined knowledge would help identify the most valuable items across different categories. We departed at first light with our most reliable vehicle and empty storage containers. A representative from Marcus's group met us at the warehouse entrance, the young man Eli, who had been part of the original encounter. The warehouse remained largely as I had seen it previously. Vast inventory of outdoor equipment organized in neat rows. We moved methodically through the aisles, selecting items according to our prioritized list. Fishing equipment for potential food sources once the ice thinned in certain areas. Specialized cold weather clothing to replace our deteriorating gear. Water purification tablets, hunting supplies, medical kits. Throughout our selection process, I noticed Eli watching us with peculiar intensity. Not just monitoring our choices but studying our interactions, our communication style, the way we made decisions as a group. I recognized the assessment for what it was: intelligence gathering. They were still evaluating us as potential threats or resources. We completed our acquisition efficiently and prepared to depart. As we loaded our vehicle, Eli approached me separately. He spoke quietly, glancing repeatedly toward his compound to ensure no one was watching. He warned me that Marcus was planning something beyond mere survival. The weapons weren't just for defense. The alliance wasn't genuine. They were gathering strength, resources, and intelligence for expansion. I maintained a neutral expression but thanked him for the information. Asked why he would risk sharing this with me. It explained that before the eruption, he had been a high school senior planning to study environmental science. The world Marcus envisioned, ruled by strength and domination, wasn't one he wanted to help create. He saw our community as different, based on cooperation rather than control. This unexpected warning confirmed my instincts but created a new dilemma. Acting defensively might trigger the very conflict we hoped to avoid. Doing nothing could leave us vulnerable to a planned aggression. I needed more information before making strategic decisions that would affect everyone in our group. We returned to the school with our valuable new supplies. I shared Eli's warning only with Thomas and Dr. Peterson, the two I trusted most with strategic planning. We agreed to increase security measures without obvious escalation, established additional observation points with scheduled rotations, prepared evacuation protocols if aggression became imminent. Most importantly, accelerated our self-sufficiency projects to reduce dependence on external resources. The next phase of our sustainability plan focused on long-term food security. The hydroponic systems were functioning well but limited in capacity. We needed protein sources beyond our dwindling preserved food. The solution came from an unexpected direction. The elementary school curriculum included a science unit on insect life cycles, complete with supplies for raising mealworms. Dr. Peterson expanded this concept into a sustainable protein production system. Mealworms require minimal space, convert feed efficiently, and produce protein comparable to beef by weight. We converted an unused classroom into a production facility. The initial colony was small, harvested from the original classroom supplies, but reproduction rates promised exponential growth. The first mealworm harvest coincided with disturbing news. One of our security observers reported unusual activity at Marcus's compound. Vehicles being prepared, weapons being distributed, movement patterns suggesting preparation for an operation. The timing aligned with Marcus having successfully implemented our heating technology. They no longer needed our knowledge and now viewed us primarily as a resource to be acquired. I called an emergency meeting with our full group. Transparency was essential. Everyone needed to understand the potential threat and their role in our response. We had three options: preemptive action, defensive preparation, or evacuation to a secondary location. Each carried significant risks and benefits. The debate was intense but respectful. The consensus emerged for defensive preparation with contingency for evacuation if necessary. Direct conflict would cost lives on both sides with no guaranteed outcome. Abandoning our established systems would set us back months in sustainable living. We would prepare for the worst while still hoping for resolution without violence. We implemented our defensive plan immediately. Barricaded all ground-level access points except one carefully monitored entrance. Established a 24-hour watch rotation with communication protocols. Secured our critical resources in easily transportable containers if evacuation became necessary. Designated rally points and escape routes. Prepared defensive measures using chemicals from the science lab that could temporarily incapacitate without causing permanent harm. For 3 days, we maintained heightened alertness while continuing our normal operations. The strain was evident in everyone: sleep deprivation, stress, constant vigilance. But the anticipated aggression didn't materialize. On the 4th day, Thomas spotted Eli approaching our perimeter alone, hands visible, clearly trying to appear non-threatening. I met him outside our defensive perimeter. He'd explained that Marcus had postponed his planned operation after receiving new intelligence. Another group had been discovered southwest of town, larger, better equipped, with actual military personnel. Marcus had redirected his attention toward assessment of this new potential threat or ally. Our community had temporary reprieve. This information changed our strategic landscape significantly. A third group with military resources could shift the power dynamics completely. If hostile, they represented a greater threat than Marcus. If potentially allied, they could provide security against Marcus's expansionist intentions. We needed more information before recalibrating our approach. I made the decision to lead a reconnaissance mission to verify Ely's information. Thomas would maintain leadership at the school, while I took Lissa to investigate this new development. We prepared for a multi-day expedition with emergency communication protocols established. If we didn't return or make radio contact within 72 hours, the group would implement evacuation procedures. We departed before dawn, taking our most reliable vehicle with additional cold weather gear from our recent acquisition. The coordinates Eli provided led to an area approximately 15 miles southwest, a former National Guard armory outside town limits. The journey would be challenging in the extreme conditions, but the strategic intelligence was worth the risk. The route took us through increasingly unfamiliar territory. The landscape had been transformed beyond recognition by the accumulated ice and snow. Buildings warped and collapsed under the weight. Roads buckled from the freeze-thaw cycle of the first weeks. We navigated slowly, constantly checking our position against the maps from the research facility. By midday, we approached the vicinity of the armory. We abandoned the vehicle in a concealed position and continued on foot, moving carefully from one covered position to another. The armory came into view through my binoculars, a large institutional building with reinforced construction. Military vehicles in the parking area. Armed sentries visible at entry points. Signs of significant occupation. We established an observation position in an abandoned gas station with clear sightlines to the facility. For several hours, we documented movement patterns, security protocols, and visible resources. Their operation was undeniably professional. Military discipline evident in patrol patterns, effective use of limited resources. Communication systems with antenna arrays suggesting longer range capability than anything we'd seen since the eruption. As darkness approached, we witnessed something unexpected. A convoy of vehicles departed the armory, headed directly toward town. 6 vehicles, including 2 with mounted equipment that appeared to be scientific rather than military in nature. This wasn't a combat patrol but an expedition with specific technical objectives. We retreated to our vehicle and followed at a safe distance, maintaining visual contact without exposing our position. The convoy moved with purpose toward the university area of town, specifically toward the geophysics building. They deployed teams in an organized search pattern, retrieving equipment and documents from the facility. This wasn't scavenging but targeted acquisition of scientific resources. Their behavior suggested a level of organization and purpose beyond mere survival. These weren't opportunistic survivors or local militants. This was a functioning military unit with scientific support staff executing what appeared to be a governmental continuity operation. Were significant for our strategic planning. We returned to our observation position near the armory to gather additional intelligence before returning to the school. As night fully settled, we observed power generation capabilities beyond anything our community had achieved. Lights, functional heating, even what appeared to be satellite communication equipment being operated periodically. During our observation, a patrol unexpectedly changed route and approached our position. We had no time to retreat without exposure. Discovery was inevitable. I made the decision to approach openly rather than be discovered in apparent covered observation. We emerged with hands visible, identifying ourselves as civilian survivors seeking contact. The patrol responded with professional caution, secured us without excessive force, communicated our presence to their command. We were escorted into the facility under guard, but treated with basic courtesy rather than hostility. The interior of the armory revealed a fully functioning operation, with approximately 50 personnel, military and civilian specialists working in coordinated roles. We were brought to an officer who identified himself as Major Carroll. He questioned us systematically about our survival, resources, location, and knowledge of other groups. I provided accurate information about our school community while remaining vague about specific locations and resources. Explained our encounter with Marcus's group without revealing the tension between our communities. Major Carroll explained their operation with military precision. They were part of a continuity of government program established years before the eruption. When the catastrophe occurred, they activated emergency protocols and established operational security at the armory. Their mission was to maintain governmental function, gather scientific data about the climate event, and eventually re-establish contact with other surviving government elements. The most significant revelation was their communication capability. They had periodically established contact with similar outposts across the country using military satellite systems that remained partially functional. The pattern was consistent, isolated pockets of survivors adapting to regional conditions. Some government function preserved in hardened facilities. Scientific consensus that the volcanic winter would eventually abate, though timelines remained uncertain. Major Carroll proposed incorporation of our community into their security umbrella. Not assimilation but protected alliance. They needed civilian infrastructure and specialized knowledge, like our sustainable growing systems. We needed their security and communication capabilities. Mutual benefit through coordinated function, rather than competition for resources. The offer was compelling but required group consensus. I explained our democratic decision-making process regarding major community decisions. Major Carroll respected this approach but requested expedition. Their intelligence suggested Marcus's group had become increasingly aggressive in their expansion efforts. Time might be limited for peaceful resolution. We were provided escort back to our vehicle with communication equipment to maintain contact. The return journey to the school was tense with the weight of this new information and opportunity. The existence of functioning governmental elements changed our understanding of the post-eruption world. We weren't isolated survivors but potential components of a rebuilding society. We arrived at the school near dawn to find the community on high alert. Marcus's group had been observed conducting reconnaissance of our perimeter during our absence. Thomas had implemented our defensive protocols effectively, maintaining security without provocation. The situation was deteriorating exactly as Eli had warned. I called an immediate council meeting and shared everything we had learned. The existence of the military outpost, their technological capabilities, the proposed alliance, the evidence of other surviving government facilities across the country. Most importantly, their assessment that the volcanic winter would eventually recede. The Ice Age would end. Humanity would continue. The discussion was the most hopeful since the eruption. The knowledge that organized society persisted, even in fragmented form, transformed our psychological landscape. We were no longer just clinging to survival, but participating in the preservation of civilization itself. The vote for alliance with the military outpost was unanimous. The question of Marcus's group remained. Their increasingly aggressive posture threatened not just our community, but the larger effort to maintain organized society in our region. Major Carroll had made clear their preference for incorporation rather than conflict, but would act decisively if threatened. We needed to attempt mediation before situations escalated beyond diplomatic resolution. I contacted Major Carroll immediately with our decision. He dispatched a small security team to our location while arranging a formal meeting between our leadership and theirs. The presence of trained military personnel transformed our community's security posture overnight. They brought communication equipment that allowed us to maintain constant contact with the armory facility. More importantly, they brought expertise and confidence that had been in short supply since the eruption. The meeting with Major Carroll and his senior staff took place at our school the following day. They arrived in 2 vehicles with minimal display of force, professional but not intimidating. Major Carroll brought his executive officer, a civilian scientist named Dr. Hayes, and a logistics specialist. The formality of their approach, the clear chain of command, the organized presentation of information, it all spoke to a functioning system that had survived the collapse. Dr. Hayes confirmed everything we had learned from the research facility, but with greater detail and certainty. The volcanic winter would persist for an estimated 3 to 5 years, with gradual warming beginning within 2 years. Regional variations would occur based on latitude and atmospheric circulation patterns. Our location in Montana would experience some of the most extreme conditions, but would also see earlier signs of recovery due to our proximity to the geothermal features of the Yellowstone region. The most valuable information came from their communication with other outposts. Similar government continuity operations had been established across the country before the eruption, part of long-standing contingency planning for catastrophic events. These facilities maintained varying levels of functionality, with the strongest operations in military installations and certain research stations designed for extreme environments. Their proposed alliance was straightforward. Our community would maintain its independence while integrating into their security network. We would share our sustainable living innovations, particularly our geothermal and hydroponic systems, with their technical teams. They would provide security, communication capabilities, and eventually facilitate our incorporation into whatever governmental structures emerged during recovery. We accepted their proposal without reservation. The practical benefits were obvious, but the psychological impact was equally significant. We were no longer alone in a dead world, but part of a nascent rebuilding effort. Purpose replaced mere survival as our organizing principle. With our alliance established, the issue of Marcus's group required resolution. Major Carroll suggested diplomatic engagement before considering alternatives. He assigned a security officer with negotiation experience to accompany me to a meeting with Marcus. The presence of uniformed military would send a clear message about our changed circumstances without explicit threats. We arranged the meeting through Eli, who continued to serve as our covered information source within Marcus's group. The encounter was set for neutral territory, the same abandoned gas station where we had negotiated our original agreement. We arrived with a 3-person team, myself, Captain Rivera from the military contingent, and Thomas as representative of our civilian community. Marcus arrived with 4 armed men, their weapons visible but not directly threatening. His expression revealed surprise at the military presence, quickly masked by calculated neutrality. Captain Rivera opened the discussion with professional directness, explaining the establishment of government authority in the region and the incorporation of our community into their security framework. The implications were clear without being stated explicitly. Marcus's group could join the emerging cooperative structure or find themselves isolated against increasingly organized opposition. It wasn't an ultimatum but a recognition of changed strategic realities. Marcus listened without interruption, his tactical mind visibly assessing the new power dynamics. When he finally responded, it was with unexpected pragmatism. He acknowledged the advantages of incorporation into a larger structure with military resources. Asked pointed questions about autonomy, resource allocation, and security arrangements. Negotiated specific conditions for his group's participation rather than rejecting the concept outright. The discussion transformed from potential conflict to practical integration. Marcus revealed himself as an adaptable survivor rather than an ideological warlord. His priorities remained protection and advancement of his group, but his methods could shift based on strategic realities. By the meeting's conclusion, we had established preliminary terms for incorporating both our communities into the government continuity operation. Eli approached me privately as the meeting concluded. He expressed cautious optimism about the arrangement but warned that several of Marcus's more aggressive lieutenants might resist the change in approach. The transition would require careful management to prevent splinter actions by those who had embraced the power dynamics of the collapsed society. The following week brought rapid changes to our daily operations. Technical teams from the Armory facility visited to study our geothermal and hydroponic systems for implementation at their location and documentation for other outposts. They brought supplies we hadn't seen since before the eruption: batteries, electronic components, medical supplies, and most precious of all, coffee. Small comforts that represented the persistence of civilization. The integration with Marcus's group proceeded more cautiously. Major Carroll assigned security teams to establish observation posts between our territories. Regular communication protocols were implemented with scheduled check-ins. Initial resource sharing focused on non-critical supplies to build trust gradually. The process was deliberate and professional, acknowledging the tension while creating structures to manage it constructively. As day 90 of the long freeze approached, I found myself reflecting on our journey from desperate survivors to community members in a rebuilding society. The world remained frozen and hostile beyond our walls. Resources were still limited. Dangers persisted. But the context had transformed completely. We were no longer alone against the elements, but participants in humanity's adaptation to catastrophic change. Our final major operation before the 90-day mark focused on acquiring crucial supplies from the sporting goods warehouse, our original objective before encountering Marcus's group. With our new alliance framework, the expedition became a cooperative effort. Teams from both communities worked together under military supervision to systematically inventory and distribute the resources. I led our school's acquisition team with Lisa and Dr. Peterson. Marcus personally represented his group, bringing 3 of his most trusted people. Captain Rivera coordinated the operation with 2 soldiers, providing security oversight. The atmosphere was professionally cordial rather than warm. Trust would develop gradually through demonstrated reliability, rather than declared intentions. The warehouse contained even more valuable resources than I had initially assessed. Beyond the obvious outdoor equipment and survival gear, we discovered specialized tools and materials that would significantly advance our sustainability projects. Solar charging equipment, water purification systems, high-efficiency insulation materials, seeds for cold weather crops. Each item represented capabilities that would improve our long-term prospects. As we worked, I observed Marcus's interaction with his team and ours. His approach had shifted notably since our first encounter. Less dominant posturing, more collaborative problem-solving. He maintained authority through competence rather than intimidation. The presence of legitimate military authority had changed the social dynamics in ways that benefited everyone's security. The sporting goods expedition was nearly complete when our communication equipment activated with an urgent message from Major Carroll. Their meteorological instruments had detected a massive storm system forming to the northwest. Unprecedented intensity, even by the standards of our new climate reality. All teams were ordered to return to shelter immediately. We loaded our vehicles quickly and prepared for immediate departure. As we secured the final supplies, I noticed Marcus studying the storm data on the military communication device. His expression showed genuine concern. He approached me directly and offered additional transportation space if needed. A small gesture of cooperation that signaled genuine commitment to our new arrangement. The convoy departed with all personnel accounted for. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the storm system approached. The military weather data indicated we had approximately 4 hours before conditions would become impossible for vehicle travel. Under normal circumstances, the journey would take less than 1 hour. But normal no longer existed in our frozen world. 2 miles from the warehouse, we encountered our first obstacle. A section of road had buckled completely from a new ground shift, likely from the seismic activity that continued sporadically following the eruption. The lead vehicle nearly toppled into the crevasse before the driver managed to brake. We would need to find an alternate route. Captain Rivera consulted his topographical maps and identified a detour through a residential area that would reconnect with our primary route. The narrow streets would be challenging for our larger vehicles, but passable if we moved carefully. We proceeded in tight formation, maintaining visual contact between vehicles as visibility began to deteriorate with the approaching storm front. The detour added precious time to our journey as we navigated through snow-choked streets and around abandoned vehicles. The temperature continued dropping at an alarming rate. The leading edge of the storm brought wind that reduced visibility further. Ice formed on windshields faster than defrosting systems could clear it. Every mile became a tactical challenge. 3 miles from our school shelter, the military transport vehicle developed mechanical problems. The extreme cold had affected hydraulic systems critical to braking function. Captain Rivera made the decision to abandon the vehicle and redistribute personnel among the remaining transports. The process cost us 15 minutes of increasing exposure to deteriorating conditions. The storm front hit with full force as we approached the final mile. Visibility dropped to near zero. The temperature plummeted below anything we had experienced previously. Ice formed on exposed metal instantly. Communication between vehicles became impossible through the howling wind. We were operating on memorized routes and faith in the driver's abilities. I guided our vehicle based on landmarks I had mentally mapped during the months since the eruption. The school building emerged from the whiteout conditions like a ghost, barely visible but unmistakable in its outline. As we approached the entrance, I could see the security team had illuminated guide lights to direct us in. The small burning markers were the most welcome sight I had experienced in our frozen world. The convoy arrived intact with all personnel accounted for. As the last vehicle entered the secure garage area, the storm sealed us in completely. The outer doors required 3 people working together to close against the force of the wind. The temperature in the garage area was well below freezing despite being enclosed. The storm had brought cold beyond anything our instruments could accurately measure. Major Carroll's assessment proved correct. The storm was unprecedented in its intensity. For 3 days, we remained sealed in our shelter as the world outside transformed yet again. Wind speeds exceeded hurricane force. Temperatures reached levels that would freeze exposed flesh in seconds. The building creaked and shuddered under the assault, but our reinforcements held. The geothermal system maintained livable temperatures in our core areas. When the storm finally abated enough to allow limited exterior observation, we discovered a transformed landscape. Snowdrifts reached second-story windows in some areas. Ice formations had created new architectural features across all structures. The wind had collapsed several nearby buildings that had survived the previous 90 days. Nature had reminded us again of its indifferent power. The storm marked a significant turning point in our understanding of the climate situation. Dr. Hayes arrived from the Armory facility as soon as travel became possible. She explained that their instruments had detected subtle changes in atmospheric patterns. The extreme storm represented a transitional event, violent but potentially indicating the first shifts in the stable cold pattern that had dominated since the eruption. This aligned with the historical data from previous volcanic winters. The most extreme weather events often occurred during transition periods between climate states. The storm's intensity was concerning but potentially indicated the beginning of eventual recovery. Not immediate warming, but the first disruption of the frozen stasis that had gripped the region. On day 90 of the long freeze, we conducted a formal integration ceremony at the school. Representatives from all three communities, our original school group, Marcus's team, and the military continuity operation, gathered to formalize the cooperative structure that would govern our collective survival moving forward. Major Carol, Marcus, and I signed a simple document outlining responsibilities, resource sharing protocols, and decision-making procedures. The document wasn't legally binding in any traditional sense. Courts and enforcement mechanisms were remnants of the world before the ice. But it represented something perhaps more meaningful: the human commitment to cooperation rather than conflict, even under the most extreme pressure. The choice to maintain civilization's fundamental principles when the physical infrastructure had collapsed. Following the ceremony, we held a community meal combining resources from all three groups. The military contributed preserved meats from their stores. Marcus's team provided specialty items they had secured from various locations. Our school community offered fresh greens from our hydroponic gardens. The simple act of breaking bread together carried symbolic weight beyond the nutritional value. As I look back on these 90 days, the transformation seems almost unbelievable. From the initial chaos and desperate struggle for basic survival to the establishment of a functioning cooperative society with sustainable systems and governance structures. The world remains frozen. Resources remain limited. Dangers persist on multiple fronts. But we have moved beyond mere survival to something recognizably human. The data from Major Carroll's scientific team suggests this volcanic winter will eventually end. The sun will return. The ice will recede. What form of society emerges from this transformation remains to be determined by the choices we make now, in the darkness and cold. The infrastructure of our previous civilization lies broken beneath the ice, but the knowledge and values that created it remain in the minds and actions of survivors. I record this testimony on day 90, not knowing how much longer our challenge will continue. Years, certainly, perhaps a decade. But for the first time since the eruption, I can envision a future beyond the ice with reasonable confidence. Not a return to what was, but the emergence of something new, shaped by our experience of cooperation under the most extreme conditions our species has faced in modern times. 3 days ago, we received the most hopeful communication yet through the military's satellite system. A research station in Brazil has documented the first measurable thinning of the ash cloud in the equatorial region. The effect is minimal, a fraction of a % increase in solar radiation reaching the surface. But it represents the beginning of the natural cleansing process that will eventually restore our connection to the sun. This morning, as I completed the regular perimeter check, I noticed something I hadn't seen in 90 days. A single bird, species unidentifiable at the distance, flying purposefully southward. One could argue it was merely lost, confused by the transformed world. But I choose to interpret it differently. Life adapts, persists, finds new pathways forward even through the most hostile conditions. The Ice Age didn't kill humanity the first time, and it won't this time either. We adapt, we endure, but more importantly, we remember who we were and discover who we must become. This is Lachlan Whittaker, Alaska Wildlife Conservation Officer, day 90 of the long freeze, and we're still here.